Hi, this is super fun. Welcome to my little series on how I make sourdough. Now I say it's how I make sourdough because you can find basically a billion different ways to make sourdough and to make sourdough bread, because since it's a chemical reaction for sourdough, so many different things affect it. The temperature of the room, the temperature of the ingredients, the type of water, and we're going to talk about all these things. But consequently, every baker who bakes sourdough bread has a slightly different way of doing it. So this is how I have kind of settled in my style from some of the reading that I've done, and what just works well for me in my kitchen and in my life too, because some people take the temperature of their dough before mixing it and stuff like that, and to me that's just way too high maintenance and ain't nobody got time for that, so I don't do stuff like that. As it is, I have plenty of tools here. So this portion of the video, I'm going to show you the tools that I use for making my sourdough. A lot of these things you will just naturally have in your kitchen already, but some of them are different and new, and I'm going to explain to you about them. So for making sourdough, really, you only need three things: flour, whichever kind you want to use, water, and patience, because you have to wait for the sourdough to ferment. So everything else here is really auxiliary, okay? But they can be really useful too. Now, first thing that, my top favorite tool for making sourdough is my Dutch oven. The Dutch oven is fantastic for baking bread. As you can tell, I have loved this Dutch oven. It's very stained all over, and I've tried scrubbing it off and it doesn't work. But the top of the Dutch oven catches the steam and pushes it back down around the bread, and that gives the whole loaf of bread this delicious crustiness around the outside. So steam is a very important part of baking sourdough bread. You really want lots of steam in there. My second favorite tool for making sourdough bread is my kitchen scale. I resisted getting a kitchen scale for making sourdough bread because that felt too high maintenance also. I was like, I don't want to measure out the ingredients by weight, but it gives you a lot more control over the ingredients. Okay, then my third favorite tool for making sourdough is my Banneton basket. Isn't this cool? This basket is fantastic for letting your dough proof, which means rise, and it is, I think it's made out of balsa wood, but it lets in air all around it, so the bread all around can start to get oxygen, and the little buggies in there can start eating the gluten. Okay, we're gonna talk about that more later. Then my fourth favorite tool, oh, I love this so much, is my lame. This is spelled like the word lame, but it's actually pronounced lame if you want to be fancy and French about it. A lame is basically, can you come in a little tighter please, Rebecca? A very sharp little razor blade. Okay, you can back up a little bit. The lame is used for scoring the top of bread, and that has multiple purposes. You score the top of the bread to let air out, to let the bread rise, and also for making it pretty. And the third reason that I've read about is that actually in villages in Europe, back when bread was starting to get popular, not everybody had an oven, so there would be kind of like one oven in the middle of town, and everybody would bring their bread in there to bake, but they needed to be able to tell which loaf was theirs, and so people started getting really creative about the designs they would do, and then they could tell that's my loaf of bread. So each family kind of would have like a different style of bread scoring, which is kind of cool. So beyond that, those four things really, Dutch oven, scale, Banneton basket, and lame, those to me are the four kind of random tools that I feel like are really important for making sourdough bread. Other cool things, there is this. It's my Dutch whisk. It's a Dutch dough whisk. I don't know how they discovered this, but they figured out this shape of the whisk. You can see it's flat. It's not like a normal whisk, but is really excellent for whipping dough into shape, basically. I also use, things that I use that you're gonna have around your house a lot are spatula, you need spoons, forks, little dishes, your Pyrex dishes, jars. You always need towels because it's messy. I don't have a fancy sifter in my life because you have to sift the flour a lot, especially for the flour I use, which we're gonna talk about in a minute. So I just use my sieve thing. So that works for me until I can get a sifter in my life. I also use a bread scraper. This is handy when turning and folding and kneading the dough. And I'll explain more about that later, but the flour that I use is really sticky. It makes a really sticky dough. So having a bread scraper is handy because if you just try to use your hands for kneading this dough, it gets really, really sticky on your hands and then you are just stuck. And then saran wrap. The last kind of fancy tool that I have is right here. This is my pastry board. If you want to zoom in on it a little bit or walk closer to it, this is my marble pastry board. It was my birthday gift to me, and I love it so much. Marble stays really cool at room temperature, so this is a great tool for kneading my dough on because the dough doesn't like stick to it and melt really fast, and then letting my dough rise on it, stuff like that. So this is also just a great tool for cooking altogether. There's lots of uses for a pastry board like this. So that's the other fancy thing you'll see me using. Now I want to talk a little bit about one of the reasons I have to have some of these fancy tools and why one of the reasons my sourdough process is different from other people's and will make a different dough is because I exclusively use einkorn flour. Now, einkorn flour is from the einkorn wheat berry. Einkorn means 1 grain. And so this wheat berry has actually never been hybridized. So that means that it looks different out in the fields where it's growing. It's a much smaller, kind of scrawnier wheat berry because most conventional wheat nowadays has been hybridized to be really fat, juicy berries, and it all grows exactly the same height so that it's easier to harvest. Einkorn wheat is not that easy to harvest. Remember in our national anthem or whatever where it says amber waves of grain? Well, modern day wheat doesn't grow in grain stalks that wave in the wind anymore. It all grows one level, it's pretty short, and that's so that the tractors can harvest it more easily. It makes sense why they've done that, but what happened is during the hybridization process, the gluten got way increased, the protein got decreased in the wheat, and basically now the molecular structure of modern day wheat, the molecule, looks totally different than the molecule of einkorn wheat. And in our family, because Matt has dietary restrictions and responds negatively to gluten, we went to einkorn wheat because it has a really weak gluten structure, has a lot less gluten than modern normal wheat, and when you're using the sourdough method, that gluten is broken down even further. The only negative thing about using einkorn wheat is that we are not used to it in our world today, and so it is gonna make a very different kind of bread than the sourdough that you would buy in the store. Sourdough in the store is very springy. This really does make a pretty rustic loaf, and you're gonna see that when we finally bake a loaf of bread, okay? Then I want to tell you about this lady, Carla Bartolucci. She basically started the whole einkorn baking like fad. So she's the einkorn lady, and this is her cookbook, and much of the way I make bread is based off of her method. And she's fantastic, but that's only if you want to bake your sourdough with just einkorn. You can do it with regular bread flour as well. You're gonna get a bigger rise out of your bread. It rises better, it's easier to knead and stuff like that because the gluten's super strong, and so it's just kind of a different experience, but you can take what I'm teaching you in this series and you can still apply it to that. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the chemistry that's going on when you're growing a sourdough starter and baking a loaf of sourdough bread. So basically, when wheat is growing in the field, it naturally attracts to it some yeast that grows, the little type of yeast that grows in between the husk of the wheat and the berry of the wheat. And as the wheat is being gathered and stored and stuff like that, that yeast kind of bonks around and gets stuck on the wheat berries. And so your flour, even just like this, you can't really see it, but in there with the flour is some naturally occurring yeast. And so what we do when we make sourdough is we mix that flour with a little bit of water, and then we wait patiently for a couple of days for that yeast to come alive because of the water. So it's kind of dormant, and it comes alive because of the water, and then starts eating up the gluten and the protein and stuff like that in your flour. And as it eats, it releases gases that cause that rise. So when your bread dough is rising, that's because the yeast in it is eating and creating gas. It's kind of gross. It's farting. That's disgusting. No. It exhales gas, okay? And the gases are what cause the dough to rise. Now, you can get just regular flour and throw in powdered yeast that you can buy in the store. But the reason why sourdough enthusiasts love the sourdough process is that when you throw in powdered yeast, it causes the bread to rise really fast. You can go from flour to a nicely risen loaf of dough in just a few hours with yeast that you buy in the store, and that's great for a lot of types of bread. What's cool about the sourdough process is that as the yeast eats up and like comes to life, it turns the complex carbohydrates in the flour into simple sugars, which are easier for your body to digest. It turns the proteins into amino acids, which we know amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, right? And then it also turns the gluten, well, it breaks the gluten down so that it's easier to digest. And in the case of einkorn flour, which already has a weaker gluten structure in the flour, in the wheat berry to begin with, when it breaks down even further, it's just much easier to digest. So a lot of times, people who have gluten intolerances can eat sourdough bread made with einkorn flour and not have any reaction. So the sourdough process, you can see, if you come in here a little closer, Rebecca, this is my sourdough starter that I use for baking bread. His name is Marty. There's a whole story behind that, but that's his name. And he, as you can see, right now, I just fed him this morning. He's really hard. He's not fluffy at all. So over the next 12 hours, as those yeasts in there eat up the gluten and break down the complex carbohydrates from the flour into simple sugars, the yeast is going to create gas and it's going to start to puff up. And we'll see Marty later. And I just loosely wrap him in saran wrap so he doesn't dry out too much, but he also gets a little bit of air. That's not a tight seal. And then this is my other type of sourdough starter. This is actually created from Marty as well. But you can see this starter is much more liquidy. See that? And that is just because it is a way higher water content. This is the kind of starter that I like to use for making pancakes. So I have a higher water content for him. So what he's gonna do is, I fed him this morning too. So he's gonna puff up and bubble up and then start to sink back down as he runs out of food to eat. This starter I also typically keep in the fridge because I don't make pancakes every single day, believe it or not. So I keep him in the fridge, and you're gonna learn that each time we feed this starter, there's a little bit of starter that we need to discard. And I throw that discarded starter from Marty into this jar of starter, Marty's son, basically, it's like Marty's child, in the fridge. And so that way I'm saving the starter that I'm discarding, and it just bulks up this guy even faster for pancakes on the weekend. Okay, so let's go over the sourdough terminology that we learned today. Firstly, there's your banneton basket. This is the basket that we're gonna let our dough rise in, and it also gives it kind of a fun swirl pattern. And we'll learn more about that as we use it. You'll see what it's used for. And then there's also the lom, which is your bread scoring razor blade. Be very careful with it. It will cut you. Then there are some terms that refer to things that I can't show you right now because I either don't have them or they are just a term for what's going on. The first one is called autolyze, and you'll see this on your screen. Autolyzing is the process that we will do later when we're making bread, when we basically let our flour soak in the water that we're going to use for the bread before we add our starter. And that process of soaking the flour in the water helps both to come to room temperature so that they can accept the starter better, and then also it's just pre-soaking that grain so that it gets it ready to rise. Then the next word is retard. It is not retard. I know that in this terminology there is the word lame and the word retard, but that's not how we say it. We say retard. And retarding is when our bread is in its banneton basket and we put it in the fridge for a little while. That retards the rise. It also cools the outside of the dough so that it's easier to score it with our lom. And also a cool dough releases more moisture when we cook it for longer, so we get an even better crusty, moist, risen loaf of bread. The next word is couche, and that refers to a really fancy kind of very thick linen cooking towel that I don't own one now. I hope to have one someday, but a lot of people use couches for covering over their dough while it's rising. You can also use it to make baguette shapes and stuff like that. Then the next word is boule, and the boule refers to the loaf of bread after we have it nicely risen and we score it and stuff like that, or even before we score it. When it's still that tight lump of dough, it's called a boule. So we'll refer to it later as a boule. And the last word is levain, levan. I've heard it said all three different ways. Our levain is when we mix a little bit of our sourdough starter with a little bit of water, a warmish water and flour, and we let that set and pre-ferment overnight. It wakes up the yeast in there, it wakes up that sourdough starter a lot, and then the next morning when we add the flour to it, all that yeast is just aggro, it's super hungry, it's ready to go to start working on the full amount of flour the next day. So those are the words you need to know. And then finally, I want to end with a question, and I'd love for you to respond to me either via text or email, or send me a video of your cute face, a FaceTime video or something. This is your research question or just your comprehension question for this lesson, and that is, what are the things that you really, really need in order to make sourdough? All right, so thank you for joining me. This was our lesson 1, tools and terminology. Thanks for watching, and in the next lesson we get to go ahead and get started making our starter. Yay!